and there's no differential impact across industries or across space, right? So that was the heterogeneity I was talking about, right? And so you could imagine that now, if they get hit with the shock, they just got to eat the shock, right? There's no space for reallocation. People have no incentive to kind of move across locations. People have no incentives to switch jobs, and trade allocations have no incentive to change because there was no change in relative payoffs, right, across the different markets, right? But then you could imagine that you could have the same economy, but then now there's some, climate shock. It hits home harder, right, than it does foreign, right? And just hold for a minute the differential impact across industries. Then just that alone, you could imagine that from an economic geography standpoint, and then people want to, right? Wages and amenities are going to be depressed in home, and then people are going to want to, adjust and move across, right? Okay. And then you want to think about, the impact, it could be heterogeneous and it could be differential across industries. So for example, in home, agriculture could get hit harder than manufacturing, and in foreign, it could be different, right? And then that kind of effect would kind of, change comparative advantage, right? And so that would be, the relative productivities change, and then, specialization and the pattern of trade would change, right? So kind of those are the things we're going to have in mind. So when we talk about market adaptation to climate change or to warming, we're thinking about these things, the extent to which, households can reallocate, right, to their, kind of optimal, their best use, right? As a way of kind of mitigating the effects of a climate shock, right? Okay, and we're going to think about the value of that and how it interacts with the heterogeneous impact of climate, okay? All right, so we're going to examine the role of these kind of three margins, right? Trading goods, migration across regions, and industry switching. And then we're going to also think about, like, in these kind of macro climate economies, like integrative assessment models, they're called, right? Do these things matter? So we're going to have all these bells and we have input-output linkages, forward-looking action, and I'll tell you exactly what we mean by what is going to be forward-looking. You have non-market impact on amenities, industrial heterogeneity, and we're going to try to tackle somewhat temperature variability. So in that sense, we're going to be trying to move away from looking at how mean temperature changes, right? So I'll explain what we mean, right? So we're going to be able to shut down all these things and kind of say, are they first order? Should we think about them when we're doing these models, right? And so our starting place is going to be the framework by Callender, Dorfman, and Para, right? The econometrical paper, which kind of blends this kind of Eaton-Corton multi-industry Ricardian model with input-output loops and trade deficits in some particular way, with this dynamic labor adjustment model of ACM, Arthur, Shawder, and McLaren area, right? And so that's going to be our starting point, right? And so what we're going to innovate on is that we're going to bring in these kind of temperature effects, these warming effects, right, to annual productivity growth, right? And so there's some literature now. This is the environmental literature, right? And then we're going to think about temperature effects on local amenities as well, right? Okay. And in particular, I told you that we're going to try to move away from the mean. So we're going to think about, the daily distribution over a year of weather. And in some ways, you're going to say, look, if I, say I have some distribution and I have some mean, I could take out, two moderate days and I could put in two extreme days, and it would be a mean preserving spread, but we're going to get a sense of how the variability might affect things, right? So we want to go to that kind of second order. Okay. And the caveat here is that we're thinking about warming, right? Just temperature. So we're not going to be thinking about, capital destruction, sea level rise, these things, that with climate change, people have documented that intensity changes, right? We're not covering that. So in some sense, you would think of us as kind of like underestimating the impact of warming, right? Okay. And so what are we going to use our setup to do is we're going to have this structural model. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to leverage a structure to kind of speak to a microeconomic literature in the environmental economics, right? And so we're going to derive the empirical, the estimating equations for, estimating the effect of weather on productivity growth and also on local amenities, right? So we're going to do these two things. And, we're going to speak to this large literature that tries to do that. That's purely empirical. So in some sense, we're trying to bridge the gap, right? And in particular, we're going to show that accounting for dynamics and space is going to matter, right? We did a reduced form thing. I won't spend much time talking about that today, but yeah, that was good. And then the second thing we're going to do is that, given that we have this macro structure, right? So we have these parameters, these key parameters that we estimated ourselves, right? And so, relative to the kind of the macro approach that people do, usually they calibrate these parameters, right? So we're going to have these internally consistent parameters, right? We have the macro structure, so we can actually simulate the welfare effects of this warming, right? So we're going to quantify this, and we're going to think about, decomposing the value of adaptation through trade and labor reallocation, whether it's through migration across locations or switching into different industries. Yes, answer.
How does it relate? Well, the first paper I was thinking about was the Custon, O'Donnellson, and Smith one, but that really doesn't have this migration part, and it's all really about agriculture. So
exactly.
But then I was thinking about the Rossi Hansberg one that was presented. How does it relate in this seminar?
Right.
So how does it relate?
So I get it like right now. Yeah. No, but that's great. That's great. So that's exactly right. Because they do get to that, and it's agriculture, and Rossi Hansberg with Cruz, right? It's kind of like this integrated macro model with kind of spatial detail. And so this is, so let me just say this quickly. So we're going to think about the importance of how we represent the climate economy, and that's the literature that we're going to relate to, right? And so relative to that, I think in some sense, it's complementary, but in a sense, what we're doing is we're going to have full labor side dynamics, not just over space, whereas Rossi Hansberg would have space, but over a detailed set of industries, right? So we're going to be thinking about, and again, if you think about Custon, Donaldson, and Smith, then we're thinking about the whole entire economy, right? And how temperature impacts that, exactly, right? We're also going to have a detailed representation of industrial heterogeneity, right? So we're not going to just assume like a common damage to all industries, like in some kind of one sector kind of world, right? If you were thinking of that way, and we're going to have, labor adjustment costs, and we're going to have climatic variability, right? And more importantly, the parameters are going to be internally consistent because we estimate them using the structure of the model as well, all right? Okay, so with respect to kind of Cruz and Rossi Hansberg, I think it's complementary because they're kind of thinking about spatial coverage and it's fine, right? Kind of seeing that space matters and connectedness matters. And we're more at kind of bridging the gap, right, between the macro and the micro, and also kind of understanding, quantifying the value of these kind of margins, right, of these linkages that we have. Okay, all right, and so hopefully it will become clearer. The sum that's okay. All right. So let me give you a quick overview of the model. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to spend too much time going through the model, right? Because it's kind of like, it's the blend that I talked about, right? So CDP, calendar, darkening power. But if you look at like one market, and so you could think of, firms maximizing the, profit, producing some output. They use labor, they use local structures, they have some productivity. They also use intermediates to make those goods. And then they can sell those goods to the consumer, but this consumer now is forward-looking, right? And maximizing household value. But at any point in time, they have some period utility where they eat the consumption good and they eat some local amenities as well, right? And so what we're going to be doing is basically feeding this, temperature into productivity growth, right? And feeding this temperature into amenities. And then thinking about, these connectedness across markets in terms of trade, in terms of migration and industry switching, and we're going to be turning these things on and off, right, to kind of see which one matters more and so forth. Okay, and so more formally, just again to remind you then, right, the trade audience, that there are two key features in this dynamic framework, right? It's like at any point T, it behaves like a standard Eq'm model, multi-industry Eq'm model with input-output loops. So the consumption allocation problem is static. There's no savings, no borrowing, no lending, right? And the firm's problem is static, right? And so all the dynamics are going to come from the labor supply decision about where I'm going to, sell my labor to next period, right? Okay. And we're actually going to just be in a perfect full cycle. Okay. All right. So here again, a preview. So we're going to be thinking about N locations. We're going to index them NIL, and K industries, K, S, and H. And in particular, in our application, again, to fix minds, we're going to be thinking about the US, right? We have spatial detail and within the US. So a location is going to be a state, right? So we're going to be looking at the state level in the US. And then we don't have spatial detail on other countries, so their detail is just going to be at the country level, right? So we're going to be connected to countries, but within the US, you are states, okay? Time is going to be discrete. We're going to have these two-tier preferences, upper Cobb Douglas over industry aggregates and CH over varieties within an industry, and the usual continuum of goods, right? Goods and tractor markets are competitive. We're going to have goods mobility friction. We're going to have labor mobility friction. Okay. And so here is a key kind of equation. So to produce some variety within that sector, right? So this is an EK sector, right? So you have some productivity for the variety, which is a draw from the special distribution, right? And the usual, scale parameter Z and the shape parameter, right? And this is going to be our target for where we're going to include temperature, right? Okay. And so you use local structures. Again, that's just immobile capital. All of this is CDP, right? And then you have some intermediate fluids that you can also use to produce, right? So this is going to capture the local climate in a particular way, right? So what we're going to basically assume is that this productivity, this location and industry productivity grows at some base rate, right? Okay. But there's some kind of temperature impact where this G is some flexible function, right? And we're going to use, like functional forms. So we're going to use different functional forms to kind of test the robustness. But usually the one that people like in environmental economics is kind of like a quadratic, and I'll kind of show you this U shape. Now, in particular, this T is not going to be a mean, like usually in like the macro models that people use, right? This is going to be daily distribution. So we're going to put them in like 1 degree bins. And then if you get too extreme cold, we're going to throw everybody in that bin and some cutoff, right? So we're going to be thinking about this daily distribution of temperature, right? And trying to get the marginal effect of each bin, right? Okay. And similarly, on the household side, you find yourself in some market, you're going to supply your labor inelastically, right? You're going to get some wage, right? You're going to use that wage to buy some consumption good, right? And if you're not in the formal market, you get some constant pay of non-employment, right? But you're also going to eat this amenity term, right? And that's going to be your state level amenity, whatever that is, right? And so you're going to eat that, and that's where we're going to basically building this, right? So then tomorrow now you look and you say, where do I want to go? And it's the usual kind of logic kind of dynamic discrete choice problem, right? Where you have, here's your period utility, then you look in the future and try to maximize across markets, taking into account your reallocation costs from markets, right? And then there's some, idiosyncratic draw that you get, which is usually the type 1 extreme value distribution, right? Okay. All right. So here's where we come in. So we're going to assume that this amenity term again has some kind of base amenity, like kind of non-temperature amenity, right? And then we're going to have some kind of thing hitting it, right? Here we're not going to be thinking about estimating this location specific, so it's going to be like a common because I think we can't credibly do it, right? But so we're going to have some common parameter here. Okay. All right. Okay. And so, just to give you an idea of the data, we're going to be using the WOD data on trade flows, 40 plus some rest of the world aggregate. We're going to, have 20 industries, it has more, final level, but we're going to aggregate to kind of match some other data that we need. And so these are, the trade flows, and then we have migration flows and labor reallocation flows within the US. Okay. All right. So let's think about the first step, right? So I want to kind of uncover these things. And and I won't oversell this, but this is I go right. So let's think about this, this equilibrium condition that we can derive. We can talk about the growth in expenditures on I relative to N. We can see that this is a function of your productivity growth. This is the temperature difference in productivity growth, and so this is the kind of productivity growth outside of temperature, and that's a temperature effect, right? So this is data, right? This is data, okay? This is not data, so we're gonna have to control for this, right? Okay, and then the growth in trade costs. That again will have proxies of that to kind of control for that, and then the growth in your input costs as well, right? So we're gonna have measures of this. So we're gonna construct measures of this, right? So with that, we basically have this kind of equation where we have the data data again, and then we include these kind of time industry fixed effects, right? Period fixed effect, and then we have some error, right? Yes.
So does the level of the temperature permanently affect the growth rate of the location?
So
There's a level increase in the temperature.
Yeah, that's Z equation, right?
Yeah.
The capital Z.
Yeah.
You have that.
this, right?
Yeah. So a permanent increase in the level of the temperature by 1 degree. Would that permanently affect the growth rate then?
So it's going to be daily temperature. So it's kind of like one more day at, right? So I think it will become right. Then it would, yes.
So you're thinking, yeah, could you do it more like a level effect?
Yeah, right. I see. So that's a little bit tricky because we're not doing the means. So a little bit. So I tried to explain it. It took me a while to actually kind of get it, but hopefully it will become clear. But that.
I think what Pete's saying is maybe that's problematic to have it. He's too nice to say that. It seems like you're kind of putting in a growth effect where you should have a level effect.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
You want to shift down to a different balanced growth path because we're hotter, but we still grow at the same average rate every year.
Yeah.
Okay, I see.
Right.
I see. So you're thinking about like the growth in temperature that would affect. I see.
No. But making the left-hand side, I think that's where it's coming in because your left side is kind of like a growth term.
Yeah.
Right.
And then the temperature is affecting the level of the growth.
Right.
It's sort of like new growth theory versus endogenous growth theory versus semi-endogenous.
Okay. I see. So we'll have to think about that. I think this way kind of relates to this empirical literature that I told you about, because I think about the temperature itself and the level that affected the growth and
right.
But there's some papers though where they're trying to look for level effects, right? So temperature affecting level of productivity or level of.
Yeah, so I think earlier on they started with that, but then they kind of moved away thinking about the effect on growth. So that was early paper by Del et al. That kind of stuff.
Burke, Shea, and Miguel, but I mean, like, Nass job market paper that has a lot of level effects in it. And he's got some estimates of that. So there is a literature more micro-based. Del Jones and Open and Burke, Shea, and Miguel have more aggregate stuff, but the more micro-based stuff tends to be levels, I think.
I see.
That might be a pretty minor, there might be a way to do that very.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, we can definitely think about that. I'm not as versed in environmental literature, by the way, but I'm learning, right? So yeah, we can definitely think about that. I mean, given that you said that, I mean, we're kind of aggregate still, so I don't know. It just depends on right, because we have like 20 industries, right? So it's pretty aggregated. I think NAF is looking at finer, right? Like firm level stuff.
Yeah, but
right?
it's just that you kind of don't, it seems like it's gonna have benefits for you not to have it in growth, because it kind of means things are just forever kind of diverging. Whereas if you can have it more like parallel growth, but just the relative levels get affected by the.
But I mean, your temperature change can be good too, right? So it doesn't have to be.
Sure, yeah.
Bad. So if you get a better distribution, then that's going to impact your growth.
It's just whether it,
Right.
I guess I agree with the,
Okay. All right. So I'll discuss it with my co-author and then see whether I'm on which side, right? But that's yeah. Thanks. I appreciate that. All right. Okay. All right. So.
Gary, could I also have a question for your specification?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I'm worried about these overtime differencing. How do you separate, like it's not the local productivity growth inducing some kind of additional traffic, population that's been causing the short-term fluctuation of your temperature? I've been wondering what time horizon you've been looking at. And you are arguably the causal impact from one direction to the other, but it doesn't seem like it's very clean. You can separate on the reverse causality channel there.
Let's see. So we're looking at 2000. So we have data from 2000 to like 2014. So we have that kind of time series and cross section.
Yeah, I just wonder, if you have somewhere, have a good productivity shock, and people come in, they drive cars to work and all these things, right? We've seen like, these things gonna causing temporary changes about surface heat, and there are a lot of works about quick urbanization gonna just causing the temperature being quickly changing. So not sure, like these are all embedded in your epsilon shocks, right?
Right. So I wonder if that would apply more to kind of like more disaggregated kind of spatial, right? So remember, we're thinking at the state level, right? So I'm not sure. Anyway, maybe I'm not getting it, but I'll have to probably think about that a little bit more.
Yeah, that's fine. It's just worth thinking, I guess. No matter what level, it's the same story.
Okay. All right, thanks. Think about that. All right, so any questions? Any more questions? Okay. So we think about this again, right? So we do the same thing, right? So remember, we have this kind of logic discrete choice problem, and we have this extreme value assumption, and so that buys you this kind of closed form solution and how people move across location. And so this pi is moving, you're in location N and sector K, and then you move into some other location and some other sector, right? And so we can get this thing in terms of shares, right? So the flows of people moving from N to I, say, relative to those who stay, okay? And we can get to connect that, as difference in climate, difference in amenities, non-climate amenities, moving costs, right? Differences in wages, and also future flows, right? And so the nice thing again is that this is data, that's data, right? We're gonna have to control for this with some fixed effects, and similarly here the moving costs, right? And then wages we can control for that, right? And so in particular, we'd get this form, right? So again, which is similar and throwing in the kind of same kind of fixed effects. Okay. All right. And so I'll show you like for the productivity effects, right? So we kind of get these inverted U's shape that people talk about. And so the way you want to think about it is that on the x-axis it's daily temperature. And on the y-axis is the change in growth, right? And so, say a day at 40 degrees reduces growth by, right, which is the marginal effect, productivity growth by a certain amount. And so what I want you to kind of get is that this is kind of like this optimal temperature, right? That for productivity growth, which is around like on average like 16 degrees Fahrenheit, like 59 degrees. No, 16 degrees Celsius. I always get these things confused, right? So 16 degrees Celsius on 59 degrees Fahrenheit. And so if you deviate from that, then then it kind of hurts for. And so what I want you to get is that we estimate this for different sectors, and you get a fair amount of heterogeneity in the impact, right? Which is what I mentioned at the beginning, right? And so we could think of manufacturing, and then services.
Sorry, what do the different lines represent?
Oh,
On
so-
each picture, what's like?
so this is ag, mining, and construction,
Yeah.
right? These are their curves, right?
Well, what does each curve represent?
So each curve represents that. All right, so let me probably explain it this
Why is
way.
why is there more than one line on this picture, I guess? Sorry.
Because you have different industries. So each line is a different industry.
There are industries
Oh,
within agriculture.
No, so one is ag, one is mining, one is construction.
Yeah.
Okay.
But once I get to manufacturing,
You'll have
Oh, those are
fun.
each separate.
these are
manufacturing.
separate
yeah.
manufacturing industries. Sorry, yeah, sorry. That makes sense? Yeah, sorry.
Got it. No, I got it.
All right. And then you go here, and these are services, right? So you kind of get this, inverse. The thing that I wanted to kind of take away is that there's heterogeneity in this impact that we talked about, right, at the beginning. Okay.
Is the one that's going up in services is on tourism or something?
I think it's like financial services or something like that. So,
Oh,
yeah. Yeah. I forgot the other side. All right. So we have that. And then what we're going to do now is kind of use these estimates, right? And then simulate the welfare effects. And we kind of do two exercises, right? So one is where we do this historical impact from 2000 to 2014. I'm not going to talk about that today in the interest of time. But I'm going to think about the one where we kind of simulate the effect from 2015 to the end of the century, right?
Hey, Gary, just can you go back a second? So,
Yeah.
so these are basically the average temperatures in terms of some growth effect. Do you also have something about like the variance of temperatures?
Yeah. So let me show you this picture. So initially I wanted to show this picture, and I said, you know what, I got confused, and I thinking through it myself, and I might confuse you by trying to explain it to you. But let's think about it this way, right? So this is kind of like the productivity. This is the kind of like aggregate response, right? So this is where we estimate that the parameter, but we don't do it industry specific, right? Just to kind of, okay? And so we get this U thing, and it tells you that the peak productivity growth is somewhere 16%, 16 degrees Celsius, right? So that's good, right? So that's no impact. That's kind of ideal, right? And so what this tells you is that, one more day at 40 degrees impacts productivity growth in that day, right? So the way you're going to think about it now is that if you think of Norway, is that Norway has more cold days, than the US does, right? Kind of more, and Brazil has, more hot days and so forth. And so the way we think about these changes kind of project this onto this, right? So, the days here we project kind of get the marginal effect, but add them up over the year and get the entire effect. Then we do it for another year, and that's the change. Does that make sense? So maybe I should have actually showed this. Okay, so next time I'll do that.
and that, the blue one is estimated, what's the variation in the data that's from cross-sectional or over time?
So that's cross-sectional and also over time, right? Exactly. Right, but I guess we're doing it in kind of like a RW sense, right? Like you have time, but you kind of, right? You're not really doing time series in a sense, right? You kind of just as one giant cross section. Right?
So a place at the equator should be generally more productive, aside from the mean effect, than a place that's kind of far away from the equator where stuff is kind of always bouncing around.
Right, exactly. Okay. So where's my back button? Okay, so my back button is not here. All right, so makes sense? Feel like I'm kind of rushing, but.
But I guess that what George just brought out doesn't sound so plausible, but what about if it's time of the year? I mean, somehow if you just did like productivity in Rochester over the summer and winter, you're not going to get big differences, even though it's vastly different temperatures. So somehow the variance doesn't.
No, but remember the yearly distribution, right? So we're looking at the year. So
Yeah,
we're looking
I'm
at
just
days.
saying though, but if it's so bad to have a year that's a little cold, why wouldn't it be equally bad to go over the winter. I mean, I guess I'm not.
Right, right. So
Somehow
those,
that makes me wonder about this.
so maybe I didn't
variance,
understand.
the negative variance effect.
Right, so it's kind of like, all right, let me see if I, right? So in some sense, you're saying, okay, so if we had Norway here, right? We do it, we get what the impact is on productivity growth, but then Norway started to kind of swap out some cold days or warmer days, so that's a better distribution for them, right?
Yeah, but I think George was saying, is Brazil good, even though the mean is bad, but the fact it's a tighter distribution than the United States, which is kind of has longer tails somehow. I guess they're not finding that so plausible, but
Oh,
it's that it says daily temperature that.
It's not, I guess it's not clear that, it doesn't seem to be the case that just variability, all else equal, is bad. I think for some countries, it seems like you take Brazil and you just give Brazil some, a couple of, much colder days, it's going to increase the variability of Brazil's daily temperature, but it seems like that's going to be good. Right, because we're taking if all the days are hot, then we add some colder days, the variation is going to go way up. But those colder days are going to really boost our productivity.
Although
we're doing pretty bad.
it wouldn't be good for the coffee.
Well, sure. But if you go the other way around, if you live in Antarctica, your temperature is, very tightly clustered around really cold days, and so productivity growth is terrible. Add some warm temperature for half the year, your variability skyrockets, but all of a sudden your productivity growth also skyrockets. And that seems to make
right,
sense.
so that's the story we're telling, right?
I think that's fine.
Yeah, yeah, so that's the story we're telling, right? And so in some sense, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be shutting down this variability to think about the mean then. So we just collapse and say if every day was at the mean, how would things look, right? So in some, you're right, it's like there's a little struggle here when we're talking about variability. We're not doing anything, and it's kind of hard for me to think about it in some ways, in a kind of clear way, but it's just this daily thing, we're kind of capturing it relative to if we're doing what people do and thinking about it. But I think that's the story.
It's just kind of hard to do a mean preserving spread in the data.
Yeah, yeah. Right, and we tried that as well, which we think was a kind of proper thought experiment. It was a little bit hard, right? To kind of shift around the distribution so that it has, it maintains the mean, but somehow has the same shape, right? So we actually did that, so that exercise. It was a bit harder to explain, so we kind of just went to showing all these in the mean.
That's a precise experiment a lot of people are thinking about in terms of just extreme weather, right? So.
Yeah. So we're trying to get at it in some way.
Gotcha.
So let's see. Okay. So, what am I doing? Okay. I think I went back. Okay. All right. So this, I won't spend any time. I'm just saying that, we kind of can think about how the distribution changes over time, over that time span that I mentioned, and you can see that, like for example, Alaska by the end of the century, they're going to swap like really cold days for more moderate days. So it's kind of like a better distribution. Whereas for like Florida, that's going to be opposite. They're going to swap moderate days for kind of hot days, right? Okay. And so here we're going to start with a baseline, right? So we want to kind of see how these adaptation matters. I want to see how the bells and whistles matters, right? So we're going to think about a baseline simulation with no input-output linkages, no amenities, no heterogeneity impacts, whether coming from climate or hitting industry differently, and there's no adaptation. So people can't respond by moving across locations, moving across states within the US, or switching industries or any changes to trade, right? And so once we have this, we see that, okay, you kind of get what you'd expect. So the warming happens, right? The south is going to get hit hard, right? And so, for example, Texas and, Florida and California, right? And I always get these mixed up. I think it's Oklahoma, Arkansas. Right?
Yeah.
Okay, right. So I got it right? And then you expect that now, but these are going to be fair and better because now they kind of getting better weather distribution, right? So the Northeast is doing better, the Great Lakes is doing better, right? Okay. And overall, the US has a welfare loss of 4.9%, right? And then we're going to say, well, when we throw in everything now, how, what happens to welfare, right? And so when we did that, the welfare changes, right? So it actually flips the sign, right? So in some sense, we take this as an indication that, adaptation matters, right? So this kind of, adapting ability to kind of move across sectors. Bear in mind, though, that this one has input-output linkages, so it had a bunch of other things that are there, and so this entire switch is not due to adaptation alone, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So here now we have like Texas losing, right? Arkansas and Oklahoma and Arkansas, right?
Sorry, what does it mean to say that Texas, like, when you say that a state loses here, what do we mean by that? Because we have people migrating. Like, how many
Yeah,
people
so
that
you are the
can
starting
migrate
period.
get counted?
So if you start the period here, we're looking at your welfare,
Okay,
right? You can move, but we're looking at how you, right? So we're comparing you start in the period, in the starting period, and then we simulate it, you can't move, what's your welfare, then we simulate it and allow you to move, you could be somewhere else, but we're looking at the starting period welfare, right? Okay, and then we see here that, there are gains again, here almost everybody kind of gains within the US, right? But, some people, some states lose, right? Okay, and so here we see that it flips the sign from, like an aggregate loss to an aggregate gain, and this is not saying that warming is good. Right? This is kind of just looking at the US, but we can look at other countries as well, right? And so if we look at other countries, we can see that they're kind of, if we do population weighted kind of welfare, then it's a loss of minus 14.6%, right? And we see that a lot of European countries gain, right? But the thickness of the line represents the, the population, right? But then the loss is kind of, in the rest of the world, so, maybe African countries here, China, India, right? These countries lose and they have huge population, and so overall, right, they're kind of losses. Okay. All right.
So then why are the rich countries the ones that are kind of pushing for global climate accords?
That's a good point, right?
No, I guess everyone.
I guess because they care about the world as a whole, right? So it's altruistic. Let's see the best. A good point, right? Okay.
Gary, I just have a clarifying question.
Yeah, sure.
Through the lens of a model, can you be more detailed about why the developing country lost and developed country mostly gained? Can you tell us more?
So we didn't actually kind of explore that. We kind of focused on kind of within the US because we had the spatial detail about adaptation, but in the rest of the world we don't. So we kind of assume that they freely can move, but we can't do that. But the focus is kind of on the US.
What is your assumption about? I'm just trying to understand what's your assumption about the mobility of the individual people.
Right. So there's no international migration, right? So if you're in some other country, you can't move, you can't switch across countries. Neither the US people can travel across countries or any other country can travel to any other country, right? But within the US, people can move across states. So that's what, with some frictions. So that's our assumption.
So then, for instance, why China lost big time then in this case?
It's just a warming effect. But we don't have spatial detail on China, right? So maybe if we did, then we kind of see that, some regions might win, some regions might lose, right? But we just don't have that spatial detail.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, but we can definitely look more into that, but we're kind of focusing on within the US because we have that spatial detail.
Okay, thanks.
All right, okay. Okay, so we could, we can also look at how the population kind of changed, right? And so, again, you'd expect this, right? So there's huge migration from, right? So red means that you kind of people moving out, right? From Texas, like Florida, California, right? And kind of the south, and kind of moving to the Great Lakes, right? Wisconsin, Michigan, and to the Northeast, right? Okay. And we can also look at, how this affects, like, employment in the industry, and so you see that manufacturing industry is kind of decline, services doing a little better. So we kind of take that as climate is kind of perpetuating the secular decline in the manufacturing industry. Okay. And so now we kind of want to think about now the model structure, right? So this is kind of just shutting off things to kind of see, is it first order or not? And the way we want to think about is that the overall welfare with everything in it is 8.2% for the US minus 14.6% for the rest of the world, right? And we're going to be thinking about, suppose we just shut down input-output linkages, what's the welfare with everything in it minus the welfare of the model where we just shut down input-output linkages, and we're doing it kind of one by one, right? And then we see that input-output linkages tend to amplify, the climate shocks, and so we know that from like gains from trade, that these input-output linkages can magnify the gains from trade, and we could know that it can magnify like from Barkey, the name of the other author, right? So negative impacts, okay? Productivity, amenities don't seem to matter much. Again, it could be because we don't have the kind of heterogeneity in amenity effects. I'm not sure, right? Forward-looking actions matter for welfare, and in particular, this industry heterogeneity seems to matter, right? Okay, and so in my example that I showed you, heterogeneity was kind of required for adaptation, right? So remember that circle, right? Okay, and the final is that ignoring this kind of this was industrial heterogeneity, right? And the temperature variability matters quite a bit as well, right? So that's where we kind of collapse all these to the mean, right? But even if we did it the other way, we're trying to kind of keep the shape the same as before and allow the mean to move, we get a similar result. Okay, all right. And so the question we want to ask now is, we want to think about this value of adaptation. And adaptation itself, that is, we have the full-blown model, input, output linkages, all these things, right? We're not shutting them down. And just thinking about just shutting down trade margin, trade adjustments, industry switching, and migration, then that alone, can turn this, kind of 3% loss when you, right? If we shut it down, we get a 3% loss. If we allow the adaptation, we get a 8.2% gain, right? I want to think about how that matters. And so in some sense, what we're saying is that if we shut down, if you think about this baseline model where we shut down trade migration and industry switching, that accounts for like a 11.2 percentage points kind of drop, right? So that's kind of like, we think of that as a total value of adaptation, right? And then we want to kind of see how does trade matter, right? So suppose we shut down trade alone, but we allow migration and industry switching to occur, then we see that actually trade alone can account for almost 90% of the total gains from adaptation, right? So the way you want to think about it is that you shut down everything here, right? All right,
So you're calling trade, though, you're including migration.
No. So this is so in the baseline model, right? If we have no adjustments whatsoever, no trade adjustments, no migration adjustments, right? And no industry switching, we get a loss of 3%. If we turn them on, it turns to a gain of 8.2%, right? The difference is 11.2 percentage points. So we think of that as kind of like the value of total adaptation, market-based adaptation.
Right, but it seems you said something about the trade being very important.
Right, because sorry.
It is, okay, but you have 8.5 undervalued migration.
Right, exactly. So this value now is kind of like thinking about that similar exercise, but where only trade alone is shut down. Right? Okay.
And then that's how much. What is that number relative to 3%?
Right. So this would say that if you had the 8.2%, right, and you shut down trade, this thing would go down by 9.7.
Go down by,
yeah.
Okay.
Right. And the same thing for like migration, right? So I guess that, I think we could think about a different way of to be on this side. We could think about a different way of kind of representing this result, but I want you to think about this number relative to this number, right?
that you could equally say just migration by itself is almost as important. Kind
Exactly.
of like either way would be pretty good way to adapt.
Exactly, right. So migration alone could account, right? But it's more important than say industry switching, but if we lump them all together, labor allocation accounts for 75%, right? And so if we add them up, we see it's bigger than the thing. Say, you know, we take that as there's some kind of substitutability across these different margins. Okay. And so if we kind of look at kind of the distribution and effect of this trade adjustment, so we find that trade adaptation, you know, almost all states, I mean, all states actually benefit from trade adaptation.
And you're including trade between the states, right? That in fact is that.
Exactly. Right. And here we're thinking about the value of migration, and we see that, well, you know, this migration is valuable to people in the south, right? Because, right, you actually want to leave the hot climate and go, and then it's bad for the people in the northeast and in the Great Lakes because you're kind of creating this, you know, pecuniary externality of kind of driving my my wages down, right? Okay.
The reason I was asking is in the Costello, Donaldson, Smith one, they find that being able to readjust your crops is super important. Whereas trade isn't important, but they meant, I think, international trade, not within a country.
Right. So I think so you're exactly right.
A little different in the way you're thinking about trade, although the U.S. is a big country, so it's almost like trade.
Right. You're exactly right. So I think their message was that the industry switching kind of the crop switching mattered a lot more than trade. And then I think there's a paper I saw, no, I can't remember, but it was kind of countering that to say that, well, it depends on what parameter you pick for this damage estimate, right? So you think about this psi k, this industry parameter that how temperature affects productivity, right? And so I think there was some debate about the value that you use, and if you use a different value, then things could be different, right? So remember, we try to estimate our own parameter, right? So this is what it tells us, that actually trade matters more. Okay. All right, but you're exactly right. Okay. And industry switching, you know, benefits virtually every state again. And this is a trade and labor adaptation, you know, kind of like together, right? And you know, again, virtually all states benefit.
Why is Alaska first?
And so Alaska is kind of like you know, people moving into you, right, and kind of pressing your wages, and that kind of dominates everything else, right? So exactly. Right? So we kind of wonder too, but like, why Alaska?
Land is the factor that makes that really congested.
Yes. So that yes.
It's probably a big share of return in Alaska.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Right. Okay, so how am I doing that? Okay, all right. So good. Okay, so sorry I raced you a little bit. I kept thinking, you know, George said to me, you have a time thing because they're doing it on the so I was trying to race through. Hopefully I get a chance to answer any questions they have. And so what we do here is, you know, just a reminder, we build this dynamic spatial model to kind of think about, you know, the effects, the welfare effects of global warming, not just the kind of aggregate welfare effects, but also the distribution of the effects, right? And we try to also, you know, think about a more detailed representation of the climate economy by thinking about a more detailed. We're trying to move beyond the mean, right? And kind of see how variability might matter, right? So we kind of, so I wanted to think about this kind of, you know, trying to bridge this gap between the micro and the macro, right? And also have the macro model so that we can actually simulate these you know, the welfare effects and kind of do these decompositions to try to understand how this thing works, right? And of course, you know, accounting for dynamics and space matters. So this would be the message, you know, into environmental economics, kind of thinking about these welfare effects, because we see that in our exercise that can actually flip the sign, right? Okay. And climate impacts, growth, and amenities are bad almost everywhere without this kind of market-based adaptation. So it's pretty important. All right. So thanks. Yeah.
Gary, going back to Sam's question at the beginning, so if I had to look at the implication of your work and the Rossi Hansberg papers, so they depict a much more pessimistic outlook, right? And my understanding is that the reason for this discrepancy is that they look at coastal flooding, which you don't, and they don't have the labor market adaptation, right? Which you do.
Exactly.
Is there anything
Exactly,
else? I'm
exactly.
missing?
So I guess it depends on which paper, right? So the Cruz and Rosshamsberg is more about, no, but they have this paper on coastal flooding, so you're exactly right there. But they have a more recent paper on kind of, thinking about this kind of macro modeling, kind of like spatial 1 degree,
Yeah.
kind of spatial detail and thinking about migration, right? And trade, but yes, you don't have the kind of industrial, right? So you don't have comparative advantage in some sense. They do have another paper on like, two sectors trying to think about the sectoral effects. And so I think their approach would be kind of saying, look, here is an integrated assessment model. We can have this huge coverage and we can have this spatial dimension, but we have to give up on some things, right? We have to kind of make some assumptions about, right, the parameters and stuff like that. We have this feedback from the economy to climate. I mean, we could add that. I'm not sure if we want to add it because we have so much going on already. And so for us, it's not so much about covering, but coverage, but kind of linking the macro to the micro, right? And kind of using the data and the spatial detail to really back out what these welfare effects are and kind of think about how the mechanisms work. Right, so we wouldn't have that, that huge coverage across many countries because of the data limitations. Does that make sense, Stefan?
Absolutely.
Right, so I think they're complementary. Okay.
So do you have a, just off the top of your head, which you might not be able to listen, it's not fair to have you compare yourself to all these other papers, but kind of like the magnitudes of like the global welfare impacts, how far off are you? How different are your estimates? Just to get some sense.
Yeah, so I knew this, George, but I don't
remember
we did so many things.
I said it was unfair.
Yeah. No, it is fair, right? Yeah.
It'd be good to just list off I don't know how the output numbers that you guys get compared to like the IPCC estimates and stuff like that.
Right. Yeah, because I was kind of thinking, right? Yeah, I was kind of thinking that. Oh, sorry. This way that I guess this is our benchmark, right? But you're right. I could think maybe we want to do that. So, right. So this is kind of like. Right, so it's kind of like our benchmark, right? Like if you were to run this as an integrated assessment model, which I think, yeah, is a fair comparison, right? But you don't have all these margins of adjustment, right? Like the models would not have, right? And that would be kind of what you get.
Is there a way to take, somehow I feel like the part that's really nice is the ability to, the people to move and using that model to think about that and the trade, and the part that's the most kind of hard to really know if you believe is the part about the temperature damages. And yet the temperature damages seem like the thing that we could import from other people and not have to be doing, other people spend all their time thinking about that. The temperature effects, and I wonder if you could just bring in somebody else's estimates of temperature effects, but then feed them through the dynamic analysis where people could move.
Right.
But maybe you're shaking your
But
head.
we can't. No, we can't do that because we're the first to do that. So usually when people
You're saying
estimate,
nobody in this climate literature really has good costs of the temperature changing.
no. So there's no estimate of parameters at the industrial level, aggregate industrial level. So usually when you kind of look at the agriculture, right, industry,
Right.
and you think of that, or you think of the economy as a whole, right? So it's
okay. But maybe you could even think of yours, if there are some good ones for agriculture, do yours overlap with what other people got for agriculture?
Yeah, we can do that. Yeah.
Because I guess I'm just saying, if I kind of thought, do I believe this, and the positive number, the place where I'd want to be more sure would be how you're thinking of the temperature affecting the productivity. That seems like the part that's a little more sketchy.
I see. Yeah, we can do that. We can do that. But I think we are the first to actually try to estimate this at the industrial level.
Yeah.
It's kind of aggregated industrial level. So that's why I was shaking my head.
Yeah.
Because I was like, no, we can't put it. So we were hoping that this would be reference for people who want to look at it. Like I said, it was kind of the opposite, but we can definitely check. I mean, like agriculture to kind of see maybe if we aggregate, when they look at kind of these disaggregated thing, if we get something that looks similar to what we get for agriculture, right? So we could do that.
I mean, some of that Ben Olkin paper, I thought, had some stuff with manufacturing versus agriculture. Who was that with? You know what I'm
Del
talking about?
Johnson.
Who?
Del Johnson.
Yeah, maybe, yeah, that's the one. Because I thought that kind of found big effects for, that was kind of surprising, because I thought it would be mostly agriculture, and then they got bigger effects for manufacturing, negative effects. I mean, so that at least had a little bit of
I see.
sectoral differences.
I see. Yeah, we can check. We can check.
Okay, so that's 3 o'clock. I don't know, George, how are we doing for time? Do we have a couple more minutes or do we need to wrap?
Yeah, we should wrap it up. Thanks so much, Gary. And I don't know, Kim, if you want to wrap it up.
Yeah, thanks.
I'll wrap it up on this end. Sure. No, thank you very much, Gary. And for everybody else who joined in online, unfortunately, we won't have the extra time today to chat with Gary some more, but we will see all of you next week. We'll be back on our regular schedule with a little extra time at the end. The rest of us locally will be sure to follow up with Gary over beers tonight. I'll have an extra one for everybody who's in the chat room.
Thanks, kid.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Gary.
Thanks.
So we're going to go to a different building.